Welcome to the Embodied Carbon and Zoning and City Incentive Programs session of our Regional Hub Policy Series. My name is Megan Lewis, and I'm a Senior Policy Researcher at the University of Washington Carbon Leadership Forum. This is the fifth of 6 sessions provided by the CLF to give an overview of the existing landscape of policy opportunities related to embodied carbon. This presentation will introduce zoning and city incentive programs, discuss how embodied carbon can be integrated into those programs, and provide a range of case studies. As described in the first session, there are a large number of strategies, tools, and policy measures available to achieve reductions in embodied carbon. This session will focus on city policies, such as zoning and land use regulations, and city green building and incentive programs. These policies have a unique opportunity to impact the design process early in design when it is still feasible to optimize the project and systems for embodied carbon through larger moves like building reuse and structural system design and selection. These policies can also impact procurement and material selection, but we've dove more into those issues in some of the other sessions in this series. So first, I just want to start by summarizing a couple of areas where cities have control and influence: land, infrastructure, and buildings. The amount of influence that cities have varies heavily depending on the country and state or province you're located in, so be sure to research your own jurisdiction. Cities commonly own significant amounts of land, all the buildings required for their own operations, as well as public buildings like libraries and schools, and importantly own most of the underground and ground level infrastructure like sidewalks, pipes, and water treatment systems that can be enormous sources of embodied carbon. In addition to the assets that they have direct control over, cities also exert a large influence of what type of buildings get built and the design of those buildings through zoning and permitting. In this session, we're going to focus more on the land, infrastructure, and buildings that cities can regulate. I recommend the procurement policy session for thinking about some of the city-owned buildings and infrastructure. Zoning and land use regulations govern how land can be used, establishing rules for what can be built, whether it's a park, a residential building, retail, etc., as well as other attributes like how tall a building can be, how close buildings can be together, and much more. Keep in mind that zoning privileges vary widely across countries, and within the US, for example, many smaller towns and some larger cities do not have zoning regulations. Another type of program we'll focus on today is city planning incentive programs, which are a broader group of voluntary policies that are a complement or precursor to phasing in regulatory requirements. Cities have rights to raise revenue by taxing property and also lead the permitting process, which gives them a range of subsidies, performance rebates, and other tools, as well as incentives like expedited permitting or plan check time, fee reduction or waivers, and density bonuses. These incentive programs can help test requirements and act as case studies before broader adoption, while increasing external capacity and awareness around an issue before broader regulations are adopted. They're also used frequently to incentivize developers to pursue green building, affordable housing, and other benefits currently, and embodied carbon can be integrated into those programs. We've grouped these types of policies together because of their unique influence early in the design process when the largest range of reduction opportunities for embodied carbon emissions exist. We think that the opportunity for zoning to play a critical role in reducing embodied carbon will only increase as we better understand the relationship between building size and other attributes and embodied carbon. On the right, you can see some examples of policy instruments and a report from the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance report that includes over 50 examples of city policies to reduce embodied carbon. We really recommend that as a great resource to complement this presentation, and we'll cover some of the case studies included in that report today. If you watched our first session on introducing the embodied carbon policy landscape, you'll recognize this slide highlighting prescriptive versus performance approaches for both material and building level policies. Again, these types of policies are complementary, but today we're going to focus on building level policies for the reasons described earlier related to city influence over the building design process. First, I'll briefly describe performance-based policy approaches to reducing embodied carbon at the building level. This type of policy allows for the broadest set of strategies available for reductions, capturing strategies like building material reuse, use of carbon storing materials, or other system level design changes, and the reductions in carbon from structural or material efficiency, as well as strategies that are still available later in design, like selecting lower carbon concrete mixes or other products. In action, this would look like setting a building carbon budget, like a kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter value for different building types, or setting percentage reduction requirements from a baseline, and then requiring the results of a whole building LCA to be disclosed during permitting or a similar checkpoint to verify compliance. The City of Vancouver Green Building Rezoning Policy is a great example of this, and we'll describe it in more detail in the next section. It's important to note that compared with material-focused policies like ByClean, which require leadership from the contractor and manufacturers, compliance with building level policies like the one described on this slide are led by architects, engineers, sustainability consultants, and others on the design team. And they fundamentally incentivize different types of strategies. Policies can also use prescriptive requirements, requiring or incentivizing a predetermined list of strategies or a single strategy that is known to reduce embodied carbon. Some examples are zoning requirements for carbon storing materials, parking requirement optimization, apartment size and space efficiency guidelines or requirements, and zoning for lower carbon building typologies. While prescriptive policies are easier to implement, they don't necessarily allow for project-specific approaches or reward innovation. But one of the policy instruments well suited to prescriptive strategies that we're still exploring is incentive programs, since they can inspire teams to test new strategies. For example, using emerging technologies such as newer carbon storing materials will require additional coordination between the owners, designers, and builders on a project. And this can be perceived as a risk, whether to the schedule or to the project as a whole. Incentive programs can help push teams towards strategies that they may be interested in pursuing, but need a little nudge to actually take that step for something that could be perceived as a risk. We'll quickly share 3 examples of zoning and land use policies targeting embodied carbon, and then 2 city incentive program case studies. And we've also provided some additional examples that are linked on this slide and later in this presentation. First, the City of Vancouver initiated a green buildings policy for rezoning established in 2017. And it's a great example of the performance-based building approach to reducing embodied carbon I described in the previous section. In addition to influencing buildings impacted by this rezoning policy, the city laid out its climate emergency plan, in its climate emergency plan, how this policy could influence other related policies. The first phase, which began in 2017, requires only disclosure of a building's embodied carbon footprint. So it requires that all projects report the embodied carbon of each building in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter, as calculated by a whole building life cycle assessment. The policy provides detailed guidelines on how to perform this whole building LCA, which are in line with the LEED Green Building certification credits related to whole building LCA, encouraging harmonization across how designers calculate embodied carbon using whole building LCAs. The next phase will begin sometime in 2022, when the city will set percentage reduction target requirements from a baseline. These targets will then be updated approximately every 5 years, along with the guidelines around how to set a baseline for each building. Last, as I mentioned above, Vancouver intends to use what they learned from this policy to inform other types of policies, including possibly adding embodied carbon requirements into the building bylaws as soon as 2023, and possibly adopting the 2022 rezoning targets into the building code in 2026. Over time, these would continually lower in a process of impacting first rezoning, then building bylaws, then the code. The next case study, which is in Helsinki, is an example of a prescriptive policy requirement that designates zoning requirements for using wood in several districts, with the goal of increasing the use of carbon storing materials. The district zone of Honkassuo required that all buildings in the district must have a wooden frame and facade. In this photo, by the way, all of the wood is supplied in Finland, or supplied from Finland. Alternatively, regulations could set a minimum share of biosourced material, such as requiring that the primary structural frame of the building must be wood or biosourced for 75% or more of the building by floor area, and other requirements. This slide shows example language from the policy. In addition to the wood requirements, you can see that the language also highlights the need for disassembly and reuse in other buildings, encouraging circular design and material reuse, and requires that at least 50 kilograms of the wood be sustainably certified. A different type of prescriptive policy approach that's in this case study is the elimination of minimum parking standards by the Greater London Authority, which has resulted in a 40% reduction in parking spaces. Other European cities and many North American cities are also reducing minimum parking standards for districts or the entire city. This case study is a great reminder that embodied carbon is not only in our buildings, but also in all the infrastructure that surrounds them. Underground parking garages in particular can be a large source of embodied carbon due to the use of equipment during excavation and to the subgrade concrete required to construct them. Embodied carbon reductions are more of a co-benefit than the focus of this policy, which aims to make cities more pedestrian friendly and open land for housing, recreational spaces, and other amenities. And then next, I'll provide a couple examples of city incentive programs that include embodied carbon. So on this slide, these are the proposed requirements for the Priority Green Expedited program in the city of Seattle, which shortens the time that it takes to get a construction permit in exchange for meeting a green building certification program and other criteria. The program sets goals for energy efficiency, embodied carbon, indoor air quality, resource conservation, and lead hazard reduction, including requirements for collecting EPDs for concrete and primary structural steel frame elements, as highlighted here. There are many similar versions of this program, particularly those focused only on incentivizing green building certifications like LEED, which often include embodied carbon credits. So that wouldn't necessarily guarantee that embodied carbon reductions are a part of every project, but it could be one of the pathways that teams take in order to reduce, in order to comply with a green building program. And last, the city of Somerville in the Boston area updated its zoning ordinance to encourage buildings to decarbonize by following the incentive structure that was successful with affordable housing density bonuses. This is another example of how embodied carbon reductions can be achieved alongside operational carbon reductions through incentivizing green building certification programs. In addition to the LEED certification requirements in the ordinance, developers can increase the unit count of their buildings if they achieve net zero ready status, which includes a pathway based on achieving the Living Building Zero Carbon certification, which requires both embodied and operational carbon reductions. While direct incentives to incentivize embodied carbon reductions rather than through green building certification programs are more appealing for guaranteeing that embodied carbon is a focus, it's important to recognize that leveraging existing certification programs can help reduce the implementation and verification burden on small teams of city officials that have a huge variety of responsibilities and may not have the technical or financial capacity to verify some of the requirements that a larger city with more staff may have the capacity to implement at this time. So in summary, some of the major takeaways are that zoning, land use, and city incentive programs can reduce the overall embodied carbon of a project early on with a really large long-term impact. Cities are in a great position to implement regulations regarding these sectors compared to a national or state scale because of their jurisdiction over the design process. And there are many both performance and prescriptive policy approaches to reducing embodied carbon through zoning requirements and city incentive programs. With that, thank you so much for listening to this session, and we hope you check out the Carbon Leadership Forum website to learn more about embodied carbon and view the rest of this policy series. Thank you.